Story 1. The Alchemist's Revenge. Nestled in the misty woods, miles from the nearest village, stood an abandoned manor whose mere sight evoked a chill. It was here, centuries ago, that Oren, a young and ambitious alchemist, had lived. Obsessed with unlocking the secrets of eternal life, Oren dedicated his life to the study of alchemy. But his ambitions took a dark turn when he was betrayed by those he trusted most. Oren's three closest friends, who had once been his apprentices, grew envious of his progress and, tempted by greed, stole his research to sell it to the local lord. But as soon as they handed over the prized scrolls, the lord turned on them, realizing their betrayal of a powerful alchemist might bring a curse upon his land. The lord ordered the trio to dispose of Oren, their friend. Late one night, they cornered Oren in his study, bound him, and took him to the cold cellar of his own manor, where they left him to starve, fearing his wrath in the afterlife. Yet Oren was no ordinary man. With his last breaths, he summoned every ounce of his dark knowledge. "I curse you," he whispered, etching ancient symbols into the stone floor with bloodied fingertips. "And all who seek to take what's mine will know the wrath of Oren." When Oren's body was finally found by villagers months later, his face was frozen in a twisted smile, his eyes open wide in death, as though he could see his revenge unfolding even in the beyond. Over the centuries, the manor had become a source of whispered legends. Few dared approach it, for tales of Oren's vengeful spirit hung thick in the air, especially on misty nights when villagers claimed to hear Oren's curses in the breeze. Chapter 1: The Discovery. One autumn evening, a historian named Clara Sweeney received a letter from an anonymous source. The letter bore no return address and was written on aging parchment. It spoke of hidden relics, valuable manuscripts, and alchemical potions all left untouched within the forgotten manor of Oren the Alchemist. An avid collector of ancient lore, Clara was hooked. She saw this as an opportunity to uncover long-lost knowledge, hidden from the world for centuries. Clara gathered a small team, her assistant, Richard, an eager graduate student, and Marco, a local guide who had grown up hearing ghost stories about the manor. Armed with lanterns, notebooks, and determination, they made their way into the mist-shrouded forest. As they approached the manor, the temperature plummeted, and Marco, usually talkative, grew uncharacteristically silent. He muttered, "There's a reason why no one goes near this place." Richard laughed it off. "Ghost stories are just that, stories. Besides, we're here for history, not superstition." The manor loomed before them, its windows darkened with grime, ivy snaking up its walls like the veins of a living corpse. Despite the years of neglect, the iron door was unlocked. Clara pushed it open with a creak that echoed through the silent woods. Inside, the air was thick and stale, smelling faintly of mildew and something metallic. The grand foyer stretched out before them, and for a moment, they paused, struck by the eerie silence. But driven by curiosity, Clara led the way deeper into the manor, flashlight flickering across cobwebbed walls and cracked paintings. Chapter 2: The Curse Awakens. They searched through rooms filled with dust-covered furniture and shattered mirrors. Finally, in the dimly lit study, Clara noticed a desk with an assortment of odd objects, a vial filled with a strange, dark liquid, yellowed scrolls, and a leather-bound journal. She reached for the journal, brushing her fingers against its rough, dry surface. A chill swept through the room as if an invisible hand had brushed past them. Marco stepped back, eyes wide. "We shouldn't touch anything here." But Clara, overcome with fascination, had already opened the journal. The pages were covered in tight, neat script describing alchemical experiments, some bordering on the macabre. Yet as she read further, something disturbed her. She came upon a section written in hastily scrawled, dark ink, recounting the betrayal by his friends, his death in the cellar, and his final curse. "Any who disturb my work shall suffer my wrath," she read aloud, her voice trembling. At that moment, the vial on the desk shattered without warning, sending dark, viscous liquid splattering across the room. The temperature in the room dropped further, their breaths forming in icy clouds. A low whisper echoed through the room, "Leave, now." They spun around, but no one was there. "Clara, we should go," Marco said, visibly shaken. Richard, however, was skeptical. "It's probably just a draft. This place is ancient." Ignoring the warning, Clara slipped the journal into her bag. But the moment she did, A shadow seemed to flicker at the edge of her vision, a fleeting figure with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. Chapter 3: The Haunting Begins. That night, the three set up camp outside the manor, unable to reach the village before dark. As they settled around a small fire, Clara couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She opened the journal once more, curiosity overpowering her fear. As she read, an unsettling realization dawned on her. Oren's journal didn't just document his work, it seemed almost to possess a voice of its own, growing more hostile with each page she turned. Unsettling phrases seemed to leap out. Their souls belong to me. I shall rise again. Suddenly, the fire sputtered and died. In the silence that followed, they heard faint footsteps around them, crunching leaves, whispering in the wind. The air was thick with the smell of rot. Then, the voice they'd heard in the manor returned, louder, clearer. Leave, before you pay the price. They looked around, but there was no one there. Marco was already gathering his things, his hands shaking. That was no wind. I'm leaving, Clara. Ignoring his warning, Clara held onto the journal, convinced that the secrets within were too precious to abandon. She convinced Richard to stay as well, though he was visibly uneasy. That night, as they slept, Clara was haunted by disturbing dreams. She saw herself in the manor, locked in the cellar, her breath growing thin. And there, standing above her, was Oren Spectre, his face twisted into a horrid smile, eyes glowing with a terrible, fiery rage. She woke in a sweat, only to find the journal open beside her, its pages turning on their own, as if an unseen hand was leafing through it. One line was scrawled in a messy, urgent script on the page: "You have until dawn to leave."
Chapter 4: The Final Stand. Terrified, Clara woke Richard and Marco, insisting they leave immediately. They gathered their things and started back toward the village. But as they moved through the forest, strange shadows seemed to follow them, darting through the trees. Marco pointed out dark shapes that moved in the periphery, yet when they stopped to look, nothing was there. Their flashlight beams flickered, then died, leaving them in near-complete darkness. Richard's voice grew frantic. "We're lost. We've been going in circles." A bone-chilling laugh echoed from the trees, and they froze. Oren's voice boomed through the silence: "You trespassed. Now, you are mine." Out of desperation, Clara threw the journal into the darkness, hoping to appease the spirit. But Oren's voice only grew louder, more furious. "It is too late. You wanted my knowledge, now you will share my fate." With a sudden burst of light, they found themselves no longer in the forest but within the manor's cold cellar. Shackles lay scattered across the floor, and the air grew thick, as though pressing against them. In the corner, a dark shadow began to take shape, the figure of Oren himself. One by one, Clara, Richard, and Marco felt an invisible force binding their wrists and ankles. They struggled, but it was no use. Oren's voice echoed as he approached, hollow and echoing: "Your lives are forfeit, as were the lives of those before you. You cannot steal from the dead without paying the price." In their final moments, Clara realized that Oren had bound their souls to the manor, just as he had with those who betrayed him centuries ago. Their screams faded, swallowed by the darkness. Epilogue: A new legend. Months later, a new rumor spread through the village. The story was that 3 people had been last seen entering Oren's manor, yet they were never seen again. Villagers claimed to see lights in the windows at night, and whispers filled the air, as if unseen voices were begging for release. Now, anyone brave, or foolish, enough to enter the manor heard the same warning: leave now, or suffer Oren's curse. And the legend of Oren the alchemist grew, with his wrath bound forever to the old, decaying walls of his haunted manor, awaiting the next soul foolish enough to disturb his eternal rest. Story 2: The Mirror of Misfortune. The mirror had been hidden away for centuries, locked in a forgotten attic in the heart of England. Crafted from obsidian with a tarnished silver frame, the mirror was massive and imposing, etched with cryptic symbols that seemed to shift under the light. Legend held that the mirror was a relic from the 15th century, made by a sorcerer named Elias who wielded dark magic with notorious skill. But Elias had not lived to see his creation's potential. He was executed by his village, accused of corrupting his people with visions of unspeakable horrors. The mirror was said to have been cursed by Elias's dying breath, trapping within it the power to reveal the deepest, darkest fears of anyone who dared to look. The rumor was that anyone who saw their reflection in the glass would meet a twisted fate, their darkest fears clawing out of the mirror and into reality. Yet, over the centuries, it was forgotten. That is, until it was discovered by a collector named Leonard Turlington. Chapter 1: The Discovery. Leonard was a renowned antique dealer, always on the hunt for rarities that held dark histories. His latest auction find had been a stroke of luck. The mirror had been buried in the attic of an old mansion he'd inherited from his late aunt, whose eccentricities had kept her house cluttered with oddities. The auctioneer had dismissed it as an old, worn mirror of no particular value. But Leonard, feeling something indescribable as he gazed into its murky surface, bought it anyway. He was drawn to it, as if the mirror called to him. Its frame was cracked, and the glass was cloudy, as though covered with a perpetual layer of grime. Leonard was an ardent skeptic, someone who scoffed at superstition. He didn't believe in curses or haunted artifacts, he believed in profit. And so, that evening, he polished the mirror, set it up in his home office, and, without hesitation, gazed into it. At first, his reflection was ordinary, if slightly distorted by the age of the glass. But as he stared longer, the image began to shift. Leonard felt a chill creeping up his spine, a growing sense of unease that seemed to emanate from within the glass itself. He blinked, and in the split second his eyes were closed, the reflection changed. Now, Leonard saw himself, but his face was pale and gaunt, his eyes wide with terror, as though witnessing something beyond description. He saw himself trapped within the glass, pounding against it, his mouth opening in a silent scream. Leonard stumbled back, his heart racing, and the reflection returned to normal, his own face looking back at him, frightened but unharmed. Shaken, he turned away from the mirror, telling himself it was nothing but a trick of the light in his own exhaustion. But later that night, as he tried to sleep, the image of his haunted reflection lingered in his mind, like an unwelcome shadow. Chapter 2: The First Victim. The next day, Leonard shared the story of the mirror with his assistant, Amelia, a young woman with an insatiable curiosity for the macabre. "Oh, come on, Leonard," Amelia laughed, "it's probably just the lighting. Mirrors do funny things in dim rooms." Amelia, determined to prove her theory, headed to Leonard's office. She stood before the mirror, her hands on her hips, and stared into its depths. Leonard watched her, half amused, half apprehensive. But then, her expression faltered. Her face grew pale, her eyes wide, fixed on the glass with unblinking intensity. A look of horror slowly twisted her features as she gasped. "What?" she whispered, frozen in place. "No. It can't be." In the mirror, Leonard saw Amelia's reflection. But it was not the Amelia standing next to him, it was an image of her drenched in blood, her eyes hollow and vacant. She reached forward, as if trying to escape some unseen force. In the next instant, Amelia stumbled back, screaming, snapping out of the trance. It was me," she stammered. "Dead. I saw myself, dead." Leonard, shaken and disturbed, tried to calm her, insisting it was just an illusion, a trick. But Amelia was inconsolable, her hands trembling as she packed her things and left his house. 2 days later, Leonard received a call from the police. Amelia had been found in her apartment, lying in a pool of blood, a look of sheer terror frozen on her face. They ruled it an accident, she'd fallen and hit her head. But Leonard knew better. Her twisted fate had somehow, impossibly, come to life. Chapter 3: The Descent into Darkness. Haunted by Amelia's death, Leonard grew obsessed with the mirror. He wanted to understand it, to master its power, perhaps even control the curse. If it could reveal a person's deepest fear and bring it into reality, then surely it held some value. He scoured books on alchemy, ancient curses, and forbidden spells, hoping to find some way to harness the mirror's dark magic. Each night, he would sit before it, hoping to unlock its secrets without succumbing to the visions it conjured. But the longer he stared, the stranger the visions became. At first, he saw small things, shadows flickering in the corners, vague shapes moving within the glass. But over time, the images grew more personal, more visceral. He saw himself drowning, suffocating in darkness, his hands scratching against invisible walls as his screams were swallowed by the silence. He felt his own pulse racing, as if he were actually experiencing the suffocation. One night, he felt something cold brush his shoulder. He turned, but no one was there. Yet in the mirror, he saw a figure, a man with hollow eyes, his face twisted into a malevolent grin. Leonard recognized him immediately. It was Elias, the sorcerer, the mirror's original creator. Elias's voice echoed from within the glass, low and chilling. "You have looked too long. Now, it is your turn to face your fears." With a sinister laugh, the sorcerer faded, leaving Leonard alone with his pounding heart and racing thoughts. He now knew the truth. The mirror's curse was unstoppable, and it had claimed him. Chapter 4: The Twisted Fate. Over the following weeks, Leonard's life spiraled out of control. He started seeing things, shadows darting through his house, voices whispering his name in the darkness. Every time he passed a reflective surface, he caught glimpses of himself looking back, eyes filled with terror, as if his soul were trapped within the glass. Driven to the brink of madness, Leonard tried everything to destroy the mirror. He attempted to shatter it with a hammer, but each blow only rebounded, leaving the glass unscathed. He tried throwing it into a river, but it appeared back in his office the next day, mocking him. Desperate, Leonard finally consulted an old mystic, a woman who specialized in lifting curses. She listened to his story with grave seriousness and told him there was only one way to break the curse. He had to confront his darkest fear within the mirror, alone, and accept it without resistance. Only then could he free himself from Elias's curse. That night, Leonard sat before the mirror, trembling. He took a deep breath and looked into the glass, forcing himself to confront whatever horror awaited him. The mirror's surface rippled, and his reflection changed. Leonard saw himself, old and frail, hunched over, surrounded by emptiness. His greatest fear, he realized, was dying alone, forgotten, without a legacy. In the glass, he saw himself wasting away, his home empty, his life's work scattered and neglected. Tears filled Leonard's eyes as he watched the future he feared most unfold. He wanted to turn away, to deny it, but the words of the mystic echoed in his mind: "Confront your fear without resistance." With a shuddering breath, he whispered, "I accept it." The reflection wavered, and the dark figure of Elias appeared beside him in the glass, eyes glinting with satisfaction. But instead of pulling Leonard into the glass as he expected, Elias reached out, placing a hand on Leonard's shoulder. "You have accepted the truth," Elias whispered. "But the curse does not end with acceptance, it passes on. You may escape your fate, but the mirror must live." In an instant, Leonard found himself alone in his office. The mirror lay before him, quiet and dark. But he knew it was only a matter of time before another soul found it, drawn by the promise of forbidden knowledge. The next day, Leonard wrapped the mirror carefully, placed it into storage, and left it for another to discover, another to face the mirror of misfortune and pay the price. Epilogue: A new victim. Years later, a young man named Peter, a collector of oddities, found an antique mirror at an estate sale. Intrigued by its dark surface and ominous symbols, he bought it on impulse, drawn to the mystery surrounding it. That night, as he set it up in his bedroom, he gazed into its depths, captivated by the darkness. And as his reflection began to shift, a shadowy figure with hollow eyes and a wicked smile watched from within, ready to show him his darkest fear. The curse lived on, waiting, with twisted patience, to ensnare its next victim. Story 3. The Phantom Tattoo. The Ink Parlor sat on a narrow, dimly lit street at the edge of town. Few people knew its exact location. It was the kind of place whispered about in dark alleys, where people sought something more than art. It was said that the artist, known only as Lucien, was a master of forbidden tattoos, designs that could grant incredible power to those who dared to wear them. But the cost was one few understood, until it was too late. One night, a young man named Kyle stumbled upon the parlor by accident, or perhaps by fate. He was at a low point in his life. His girlfriend had left him, he'd lost his job, and he felt utterly powerless. He'd heard rumors about Lucien and his mystical tattoos, but they'd always sounded like urban legends. Still, in his desperation, he felt compelled to find out if the stories were true. As he approached the shop, a faint light flickered from inside. Pushing open the door, he found himself face to face with Lucien, a man with piercing, dark eyes and intricate tattoos winding up his arms, each line sharp and precise. "You're here for something special, aren't you?" Lucien's voice was soft, almost hypnotic. Kyle nodded, feeling a strange pull to trust this stranger. I heard you could give me something powerful." Lucien nodded knowingly and gestured for Kyle to sit. "I offer more than just tattoos. I offer strength, clarity, control." Kyle's heart pounded with anticipation. "Yes, that's what I need. Something to make me stronger, more focused." Lucien smiled, but there was something unsettling about it. "There's one tattoo I think would suit you well. It's ancient, used by warriors of old to channel power and dominate their fears." He pulled out a sketch, an intricate design of twisting lines and symbols that seemed to pulse on the paper itself. "It's perfect," Kyle breathed, mesmerized by the image. "What's the price?" Lucien's eyes gleamed. "The tattoo will cost you only what it requires in return, a promise that you will keep it forever and use the power wisely." Kyle shrugged, eager to begin. He barely listened as Lucien explained the process, simply nodding in agreement. When Lucien's needle touched his skin, an intense warmth radiated from it, as though the ink itself was alive. The design curled around his forearm, black lines twisting and winding until they formed a band of ancient runes. When the tattoo was finished, Kyle felt a surge of energy, stronger than he'd ever known. The pain, surprisingly, was gone, leaving behind only a subtle warmth and the feeling of something stirring beneath the surface. Lucien looked at him gravely. "Remember, the tattoo has its own needs. You'll understand soon enough." Chapter 1: The First Taste of Power. Over the next few days, Kyle noticed a strange change within himself. His confidence grew, his strength increased, and he felt invincible. He confronted his ex-girlfriend and, for the first time, felt no pangs of insecurity or regret. At the gym, he lifted weights he hadn't managed in years, leaving others impressed and even envious. He reveled in his newfound power, convinced he'd made the right choice. But there was something else. At times, the tattoo would heat up, a searing warmth that would pulse through his arm, almost like a heartbeat. It would happen at the strangest moments, when he felt anger or desire, when he was challenged or stressed. And when it happened, he would feel a sudden, unshakable urge to act, as if the tattoo was pushing him to follow his impulses. One night, he was out with friends at a bar when a man bumped into him, spilling his drink. The man muttered a half-hearted apology, but Kyle felt his anger flare. His tattoo began to burn, the symbols on his arm glowing faintly under his sleeve. Before he knew what he was doing, Kyle had grabbed the man by his shirt and shoved him back, sending him crashing into a table. His friends stared at him in shock as the man stumbled away, cursing. Kyle's heart raced, and he felt a mix of exhilaration and fear. The tattoo had made him do it, he realized. It was pushing him to unleash his anger. Chapter 2: The Tattoo's Demands. Kyle tried to ignore it, but over the next few days, the tattoo's influence became more intense. Every time he experienced a strong emotion, it would burn and pulse, urging him to act out, to seize control of any situation he encountered. It felt as though something within the tattoo wanted more of him. Then one night, as he lay in bed, a searing pain shot through his arm. He looked down and saw the tattoo glowing with a strange, eerie light. The lines twisted and seemed to move, shifting into new shapes. Panic filled him, and he tried to wipe it away, as though he could remove it like ink on his skin. But it was no use, the tattoo felt like it was etched into his very bones. He heard a whisper in his mind, faint and taunting, "I need more, give me more." Kyle clenched his teeth, trying to shake the voice from his head. But it only grew stronger, demanding that he seek out people, confront them, overpower them. The tattoo craved control over him and everyone around him. The next day, Kyle attempted to go about his life as usual, but he couldn't stop the tattoo from flaring up at random moments. It pushed him to pick fights, to assert dominance in every interaction. And worst of all, he could feel his own will slipping, as though he were no longer in control of his body. The tattoo was steering him like a puppet, guiding his actions. Chapter 3: Losing Control. Desperate, Kyle returned to the ink parlor to confront Lucien. He found him in the dimly lit shop, calmly polishing his tattoo equipment. "You didn't tell me it would take control of me," Kyle shouted, his voice shaking. Lucien looked up with a faint smile. "It only takes what you give it. You wanted power, control. This tattoo gives you exactly that. But it also demands balance. If you can't resist its influence, it will continue to consume you." Kyle felt a surge of anger, and the tattoo flared with burning heat, searing his skin. "Take it off," he shouted. Lucien shook his head. "Once a phantom tattoo is inked, it cannot be removed. It's bound to your soul. The only way to rid yourself of it is to give it exactly what it craves, or to let it take you." "What does it want?" Kyle asked, his voice barely a whisper. Lucien's gaze darkened. "It wants to feed on power, control, dominance. The more you use it to assert yourself, the stronger it becomes. Eventually, it will consume your spirit entirely, leaving you a hollow shell, a puppet for the dark magic that lives within it." Kyle backed away, horrified. He left the shop, but Lucien's words echoed in his mind. The tattoo was hungry, he realized, and it wouldn't stop until it had devoured him completely. Chapter 4: The Final Showdown. As days turned into weeks, Kyle fought desperately to regain control, but the tattoo only grew stronger. He could no longer resist its influence, feeling like a prisoner in his own body. It led him to dark places, pushing him to confront anyone who dared to stand in his way. His friends avoided him, frightened by the man he'd become. He was consumed by paranoia, convinced that everyone around him was a threat to his power. One night, the tattoo's demands reached a fever pitch. It pulsed with a searing heat, and Kyle could feel his vision darkening, his thoughts slipping away. The tattoo's whisper echoed in his mind, louder and more insistent: "Submit, let go." In a last-ditch effort, Kyle fought back, summoning every ounce of willpower he had left. He pressed his fingers against the tattoo, feeling its heat burn into his skin. "You won't take me," he growled through clenched teeth. The tattoo's whisper turned into a roar, filling his mind with images of power, violence, and submission. But Kyle focused, pulling his mind away from the darkness, refusing to give in. Finally, after what felt like hours of struggle, the tattoo's burning faded. Exhausted, he collapsed onto the floor, his arms still throbbing with pain. He felt a hollow emptiness in his soul, as though a piece of himself had been carved away. The tattoo had weakened, but he knew it wasn't gone. It lay dormant, waiting for his next moment of weakness. Epilogue: A haunting reminder. Kyle left town, hoping to outrun the tattoo's influence. But no matter how far he went, he couldn't escape it. The phantom tattoo remained, a twisted reminder of the power he'd craved and the price he'd paid. And now, wherever he went, he avoided mirrors and dim rooms, terrified of the moment when he would once again see his reflection, feel the tattoo's burning hunger, and realize that one day it would consume him completely. Story 4. The Witch's Toll. The village of Thornwood lay nestled in a valley, hemmed in by dense forests and towering mountains. The land was harsh, the winters long, and the harvest unpredictable. Yet for generations, the people had managed to scrape by, thanks to an uneasy alliance with an ancient power, a witch who lived on the edge of the woods. Every harvest season, she would grant them abundance, ensuring their fields thrived and their barns overflowed with grain. But this generosity came at a terrible price, one that was whispered about only in hushed tones. It began generations ago when a drought nearly wiped out the village. Desperate and starving, the people had turned to an old, blind woman who claimed she could save them. She promised them rain, fertile soil, and strong crops, but in return, she demanded a toll, one that wasn't paid in gold or silver, but in blood. The price was simple yet cruel. Each year, one family would lose a member. The chosen would be taken to the forest's edge at midnight and left there as an offering. No one knew what became of them, only that the village's fields would bloom the following morning. Chapter 1: A New Year's Harvest. As another harvest approached, the villagers prepared for their grim ritual. They gathered in the town square, their faces somber as they awaited the announcement of the chosen family. The selection was always carried out by the elders, using an ancient urn filled with the names of every family in Thornwood. Over the years, everyone in the village had lost someone, a child, a parent, a sibling. This year, it was the Braxton family's turn. The announcement hit like a thunderclap. Daniel Braxton, a widower and father to 3, had already lost so much. His wife had passed years ago, and his youngest son was sickly. As he held his children close, Daniel felt a wave of dread wash over him. He knew he could not bear to lose another loved one, but the villagers were firm. The toll had to be paid, or they would all suffer. That night, Daniel stayed awake, thinking of ways to protect his family. He knew the witch's demands were absolute, but he couldn't accept sacrificing one of his own. As the hours dragged on, a plan formed in his mind, a dangerous, reckless plan that would change the village forever. Chapter 2: The Witch's Domain. Under the cover of darkness, Daniel made his way to the forest's edge, carrying an offering of herbs and silver. He walked cautiously, each step echoing with the rustling of leaves and the faint hoot of owls. The villagers never entered the forest, for it was said that the witch had eyes everywhere, watching for intruders. But Daniel was willing to risk her wrath. Finally, he reached a clearing, lit only by the ghostly light of the moon. He called out, his voice trembling, "I seek an audience with the Witch of Thornwood." Moments passed in silence, and he began to wonder if he'd made a mistake. But then, a figure emerged from the shadows, a tall woman cloaked in tattered robes, her hair wild and streaked with silver. Her eyes glowed with an unnatural light, piercing into him as if reading his soul. "Why do you come here, mortal?" she asked, her voice like the creaking of ancient wood. Daniel swallowed, mustering his courage. "Please, spare my family. I'll give you anything else, anything at all. Just don't take my children." The witch tilted her head, a cruel smile spreading across her face. "You would defy the pact? The toll must be paid." "But why must it be someone's life?" he pleaded. "Take my crops, my livestock, anything but my family." The witch laughed, a hollow sound that echoed through the forest. "Your crops cannot satisfy my hunger. This land is bound to me by blood, and it is blood I require. Without it, your precious harvest would wither, your village starve. You need me, Daniel Braxton, and I have already given too much to your people." Her words chilled him to his core. He knew she spoke the truth. Without the witch's help, the village would suffer. But he could not accept her demands. Gritting his teeth, he spoke again. "If it's blood you want, take mine." The witch's eyes flashed with interest. "You would give yourself in place of another?" "Yes," he whispered, his voice barely steady. "Take me, but spare my children." The witch considered him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well, Daniel Braxton. I accept your offer. But know this, you will pay in ways you cannot yet imagine." With a wave of her hand, she dismissed him, and he stumbled back, the forest closing in around him. Chapter 3: The Price of Defiance. The next morning, Daniel woke to find the fields lush and vibrant. The village rejoiced, unaware of the deal he had struck with the witch. For a brief moment, he felt relief, believing he had saved his family from the curse. But that night, he noticed a strange mark on his wrist, a small, dark symbol that resembled a twisted vine. Days passed, and the mark grew darker, spreading like ink across his skin. It began to burn, a searing pain that would flare up without warning. He tried to hide it from the villagers, but rumors began to spread. People noticed his gaunt face, the way he flinched as though something unseen tormented him. One night, as he lay writhing in pain, the witch appeared at his bedside, her eyes filled with satisfaction. "This is the toll you have chosen, Daniel," she murmured. "Your life will be slow, agonizing, and endless." He stared at her in horror. "What do you mean?" "You defied the pact. I accepted your life, yes, but not in the way you imagined. You shall live, cursed by the same magic that brings life to your crops. You will never age, never die. Instead, you will feel the pain of every lost soul, every sacrifice made to protect this village." Daniel's mind reeled as the full weight of her words settled in. The curse was not death, but immortality, an eternity of suffering, a life bound to the witch and her dark magic. He was doomed to endure the toll he'd fought so hard to escape. As the years wore on, Daniel remained the same, untouched by time, even as the villagers around him grew older and eventually passed away. He watched his children grow, marry, and have children of their own, and he was forced to see each generation face the witch's demands. Every year, a new name was drawn, and every year, he felt the pain of their loss as though it were his own. Chapter 4: The Curse Unleashed. As the decades slipped by, Daniel became a ghostly figure in the village, rarely seen, his face etched with suffering. The villagers came to regard him as a cursed relic, whispering tales of his unholy pact with the witch. Parents would warn their children to stay away from him, and soon, he was all but forgotten. But Daniel's heart grew heavy with resentment, his pain morphing into a fierce determination. He couldn't bear to see his family suffer, to watch generation after generation fall prey to the witch's curse. And so, one fateful night, he ventured back to the forest, this time with nothing to lose. He reached the clearing, his voice trembling with rage. "Witch! Show yourself!" She appeared, as if summoned by his fury, her eyes gleaming with amusement. "You return, even after all you've endured? I won't let you take another soul," he said, his voice steady. "End this curse, or I will find a way to destroy you." The witch laughed, a sound that cut through the night like a blade. "Destroy me? Foolish man. This land is bound to me. Without my magic, your village would fall to ruin." "Then let it," he said, his voice filled with a grim resolve. "Better that than to live under your shadow." For the first time, the witch's smile faltered. Her eyes narrowed, and her voice grew cold. "You dare to challenge me?" Daniel's mark flared, burning with an intensity he'd never felt before. Pain shot through him, but he gritted his teeth, refusing to back down. He would bear any suffering, face any torment, if it meant breaking the cycle. With a roar, he raised his hand, the mark glowing as he called upon the witch's own magic, twisted and corrupted within him. A storm of energy erupted, blinding them both in a torrent of light and shadow. The trees trembled, the ground shook, and Daniel felt his very soul tearing apart. When the light faded, Daniel lay on the forest floor, his body aching but free from the mark. The witch was gone, her essence scattered like ashes in the wind. The curse had broken, Thornwood was free. Epilogue: A new beginning. The following morning, the village awoke to find the fields as barren as winter. Without the witch's magic, the land was harsh, unforgiving, and the villagers knew they would have to find a new way to survive. But they were grateful to be free of the toll, their loved ones safe from the witch's demands. As for Daniel, he left Thornwood, his heart heavy with memories of the years he'd lost. Story 5. The Bewitched Doll. In the quiet town of Willowbrook, there was an old curiosity shop filled with oddities from around the world. The shop's owner, Mrs. Moreau, was a reclusive woman with a peculiar habit of talking to the items on her shelves, especially the ones she kept locked away in glass cases. Among these was a porcelain doll, its delicate face frozen in an eerie half-smile and its eyes wide and unsettlingly lifelike. Despite her care, the doll was known around town as Lottie the Cursed Doll. The doll had once belonged to a practitioner of dark arts, a woman named Lottie Gray, who was both feared and respected by the townsfolk of her day. Lottie had been an expert in spells, charms, and curses, until the night she vanished without a trace. Rumor had it she trapped part of her soul inside the doll to protect herself. But if anyone treated the doll with disrespect, Lottie would return to punish them. The townsfolk generally avoided Mrs. Moreau's shop, fearing the dark aura that seemed to linger around it. But one day, a young girl named Emily and her mother, new to town, wandered into the shop. Emily's eyes sparkled with curiosity as she looked over the strange objects. And then she saw the doll. "Mommy! Look at this one," she exclaimed, pointing to the porcelain figure. Mrs. Moreau's face darkened. "That doll is not for sale," she said in a low, firm tone. But Emily's mother, Helen, took a liking to the doll's craftsmanship and offered Mrs. Moreau a handsome sum. Reluctantly, and against her better judgment, Mrs. Moreau agreed to let the doll go. "Take care of her," Mrs. Moreau warned. "Show her respect, or there'll be consequences." Helen dismissed the warning as nothing more than a scare tactic to increase the doll's mystique. But Mrs. Moreau's face was grave as she watched them leave, her eyes full of regret. Chapter 1: Strange Events Begin. Back at home, Emily placed the doll on her dresser. She loved the doll's fine details, its painted blue eyes, its glossy black curls, its delicate lace dress. She named her Lucy, much to her mother's amusement. For the first few days, nothing unusual happened, but soon, odd things began to occur. One morning, Helen walked into Emily's room to find the doll lying on the floor, far from the dresser where it had been carefully placed the night before. Thinking Emily had dropped it, she returned it to the dresser. But every morning, the doll was found in a new spot, the bed, the windowsill, or even sitting in Emily's reading chair. "Mom, Lucy's moving around by herself," Emily told her one evening, wide-eyed. Helen laughed, brushing it off as her daughter's active imagination. But Emily was insistent. "She was on the floor when I woke up. And she's smiling differently now." Helen looked at the doll. It seemed like any other old doll, its painted smile unchanged, its eyes staring blankly ahead. She shook her head, dismissing her daughter's worries. But over the next few nights, Helen began to hear strange noises coming from Emily's room. Footsteps, the soft scraping of something moving across the floor. Each time she checked, Emily was sound asleep, and the doll sat peacefully on the dresser, its face serene. Chapter 2: The Doll's Warning. One night, Helen accidentally knocked the doll off the dresser while tidying up. She didn't think much of it, but a shiver ran down her spine as she picked it up. The doll's face seemed angrier, the faint smile more like a sneer. Helen placed it back on the dresser, muttering, "You're just a silly old doll." The moment she turned off the lights, a soft scratching sound echoed from the dresser. Helen froze, her heart racing. She flicked the lights back on and found the doll exactly where she'd left it, but she could have sworn its head was tilted just a little further to the side. The next morning, Helen found a message scratched into Emily's mirror. It was faint, but unmistakable: "Respect me." Emily, meanwhile, had grown scared of the doll, begging her mother to put it away. But Helen, determined not to be frightened by a mere toy, refused. That night, Emily heard whispering. She pulled the covers over her head, her heart racing, as the whispers grew louder and clearer. It was a woman's voice, low and raspy. "Ungrateful child, show me respect, or you will pay the toll." Emily cried out, and Helen rushed into the room, only to find her daughter trembling in bed, the doll somehow lying beside her despite being placed on the dresser earlier. "She's mad at me, Mommy," Emily whimpered. "Lucy's mad." Helen looked at the doll, a knot forming in her stomach. She snatched it up, determined to prove to her daughter that it was just a harmless toy. But as her fingers closed around it, a cold, almost electric sensation shot up her arm, and she dropped it in shock. Chapter 3: The Haunting Escalates. That night, Helen locked the doll in the attic, hoping the distance would ease her daughter's fears. But that only seemed to make things worse. The next day, strange things began happening all over the house. Objects fell off shelves, doors slammed shut without warning, and faint whispers echoed through the rooms. Helen and Emily began finding new messages scratched into mirrors and painted on walls: disrespectful, ungrateful, beware. One night, as Helen went to check on her daughter, she found a horrifying sight. Emily's bed sheets were covered in small, childlike handprints in a deep, dusty red. And on her pillow lay the doll, its face twisted into a scowl, as though it had moved of its own accord from the attic. In a panic, Helen threw the doll outside, burying it in the garden, convinced that would end the strange happenings. But the next morning, the doll was back on Emily's dresser, its once smiling face now a grimace of rage. Terrified, Helen returned to Mrs. Moreau's shop. The old woman's face grew pale as she listened to Helen's tale. "I warned you," she said solemnly. "The doll contains the spirit of Lottie Gray, and she does not tolerate disrespect. Burying her will only anger her further. What can I do?" Helen pleaded, desperation in her voice. "There's only one way to break the connection," Mrs. Moreau explained. "You must show the doll the respect it demands. Keep it in a place of honor, never mock or mistreat it. And, you must apologize to it, sincerely." Chapter 4: Appeasing the Doll. Reluctantly, Helen took the doll back home. She set it on a small table in the living room, draping it with a clean cloth and placing candles around it. That evening, she sat with Emily beside the doll, and together, they spoke to it, offering heartfelt apologies. "I'm sorry, Lucy," Emily whispered, her voice shaky. "I didn't mean to be disrespectful. Please forgive me." Helen, swallowing her pride, spoke as well. "I'm sorry, Lottie. I should never have dismissed your warnings or mistreated your doll. Please, release my family from your anger." For a moment, the room was still. Then a cold breeze swept through, extinguishing the candles. The doll's face seemed to soften, its features relaxing as if in response to their words. Over the following days, the strange events lessened, and the doll remained in its place, undisturbed. The whispers faded, and the messages on the mirrors stopped. Emily slept peacefully, no longer fearing the doll, and Helen felt a sense of calm return to their home. Epilogue: A lasting legacy. Though peace had returned, Helen never dared to move the doll from its honored place. The doll, now forever known as Lucy, remained an eerie presence in their home, a reminder of the price of disrespecting the unknown. Over time, Emily grew used to it, even talking to it on occasion, as if it were a member of the family. Visitors would occasionally ask about the doll, noting its unsettlingly lifelike gaze. Helen would only smile and say, "That's Lucy. She likes to be respected." But late at night, Helen would sometimes hear a faint, almost satisfied hum coming from the living room. She knew it was the doll, Lottie's spirit resting contentedly. And though it sent a chill down her spine, she was grateful that the haunting had finally come to an end, so long as they kept paying their respects. Story 6. Here's a haunting tale based on Eyes of the Abyss, where an artist's creativity is twisted by an insidious curse. Eyes of the Abyss. Colin Gray was an artist known for his dark, surreal drawings, works filled with shadows and strange, otherworldly beings. Despite his talent, he struggled to gain recognition and lived alone in a small, cluttered studio on the edge of the city. One evening, after a particularly bad day at a gallery rejection, he wandered into an antique store, hoping to distract himself. The store was filled with dusty treasures from forgotten eras, and as he browsed, a glimmer caught his eye. It was a wooden box, ornately carved and covered in an intricate pattern of swirls and lines that seemed to ripple under the dim light. Inside lay a set of charcoal pencils, aged but perfectly preserved. Something about the dark, almost glossy texture of the charcoal felt strange, even inviting. "Interested in those, are you?" the shopkeeper asked, her voice a low murmur. These charcoals belonged to an artist long ago, a man who could bring his darkest visions to life. But use them carefully. Colin laughed, brushing off her words, and bought the set. He thought little of the shopkeeper's warning as he carried them home, eager to try out the charcoals that night. Chapter 1: The First Drawing. Settling down at his desk, Colin placed a blank canvas in front of him and picked up one of the charcoal pencils. It felt smooth and almost warm in his hand, as if it had a life of its own. Inspired by an idea that had been haunting him, a series of disembodied eyes, staring out from a deep void, he began to draw. With each stroke, the eyes seemed to come alive on the canvas, as though they were peering into his soul. Their shapes were unnatural, some round and bright, others elongated and narrow. Each eye held a unique emotion: anger, sorrow, curiosity, and even a chilling emptiness. He worked for hours, consumed by the eerie allure of his own creation. When he finally finished, Colin stepped back to admire the piece. The eyes seemed to stare out from the canvas, following him around the room. He felt a strange chill but dismissed it as exhaustion. With a shrug, he propped the canvas up on his easel and went to bed, eager to show it off at his next gallery meeting. But that night, he dreamed. Chapter 2: The Eyes in His Dreams. In his dream, Colin found himself wandering through a vast, dark void. Everything was silent except for his own footsteps echoing around him. As he walked, he felt an intense sensation of being watched. He looked around, but nothing appeared to be there, just darkness stretching endlessly. Then he saw them. Eyes. Hundreds of them, all different sizes, shapes, and colors, peering at him from the darkness. He recognized them instantly. They were the same eyes he had drawn. They blinked slowly, their gaze fixed on him with a mixture of curiosity and malice. The feeling of being studied, dissected, crept over him, and a deep, bone-chilling fear took hold. One of the eyes moved closer, hovering just inches from his face. He tried to turn away, but found himself paralyzed. The eye seemed to grow larger, swallowing him with its gaze until he was consumed by it entirely. He woke with a start, drenched in sweat, the feeling of that eye's cold stare lingering in the darkness of his room. Shaking it off as a nightmare, he tried to go back to sleep, but the sensation of being watched persisted. In the corner of his room, just beyond his sight, he felt a presence, several presences. He could almost see the outline of eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness. Chapter 3: The Manifestation. Over the next few days, Colin continued to draw, compelled by a force he couldn't explain. He added more eyes to his canvas, each more haunting than the last. But with every new drawing, the dreams grew more vivid. The eyes in his nightmares became clearer, sharper, and their numbers multiplied. Each night, they drew closer, crowding around him, suffocating him with their stares. One morning, he awoke to find his bedroom filled with a faint charcoal scent. He looked around, puzzled, and froze. There, on his dresser mirror, was a dark smudge, a perfect outline of an eye. He rubbed at it, convinced it was a trick of the light, but the mark wouldn't disappear. It was as though the eye had been burned into the glass. As the days passed, the smudges began appearing everywhere, on his windows, his bathroom mirror, even on the walls of his studio. Each one was identical to the eyes he had drawn, watching him in every room, every corner. Colin began to feel trapped, his own home turning into a gallery of accusatory stares. He tried to destroy the canvas, convinced it was the source of the curse. But when he tore it apart, he found the pieces reassembled on his easel the next morning, the eyes more intense than ever. Chapter 4: The Descent into Madness. Colin's work began to suffer. He stopped drawing anything other than eyes, filling sketchbooks with pages of nothing but staring, unblinking eyes. He stopped going out, afraid of what he might see. Even his reflection began to change. His own eyes seemed duller, haunted, as though they were absorbing the gaze of every eye he'd drawn. Then the voices began. At first, they were whispers, barely audible. But soon, they grew louder, filling his ears with murmurs and laughter, as though mocking his fear. He'd catch fragments of words, his name, followed by soft laughter. And always, he could feel their eyes on him. One night, as he lay in bed, unable to sleep, he heard footsteps, light, padding sounds, moving toward his room. His heart pounded as he sat up, but there was nothing there. Only darkness, and the faint sound of breathing. He stumbled out of bed, reaching for his phone, desperate to call someone, anyone, when he saw it. In the corner of his room, a figure stood, a tall, shadowy outline, with dozens of eyes scattered across its body, each one staring at him with cold malice. The figure moved closer, its eyes blinking in unison, the sound a slow, rhythmic pulse. Colin tried to scream, but his voice caught in his throat. The figure stopped mere inches from him, and he felt its cold breath on his face. A voice, low and mocking, whispered in his ear, "We see you, Colin." Chapter 5, Breaking the Curse. Desperate, Colin returned to the antique store, but it was closed, the windows dark and empty. He pounded on the door, shouting for the shopkeeper, but no one answered. At the peak of his despair, he remembered the story the shopkeeper had told him. He realized he would have to confront the curse himself. That night, Colin set up his easel in his studio, laying out the charcoals in front of him. He stared at the unfinished canvas, the eyes staring back with a look of disdain. "I'm not afraid of you," he whispered, his voice shaking. "You're just a drawing. You don't control me." But as he raised the charcoal to the canvas, his hand froze. He felt the presence again, the figure with the eyes, standing just behind him, breathing down his neck. The voices rose, filling his ears with taunts and laughter, drowning out his thoughts. Trembling, he lowered the charcoal and spoke aloud, "I release you. I give you back the darkness. Return to where you belong." The voices fell silent, the room thick with an unnatural stillness. Slowly, the figure in the corner began to fade, its eyes closing one by one until only darkness remained. Colin took a deep breath, realizing that the cursed charcoals had bound him to his own nightmares, using his creativity to feed a malevolent force. With a shudder, he gathered the charcoals, wrapping them in cloth, and took them outside. As dawn broke, he buried them in a hidden corner of the garden, far from his studio. Epilogue, the final glance. In the days that followed, Colin's life returned to normal. The eyes disappeared from his home, his reflections regained their natural appearance, and he no longer dreamed of being watched. But he never again felt the same confidence in his art. There was a fear lurking in the back of his mind, a memory of those eyes and the figure that watched him from the shadows. And every so often, he would glance over his shoulder, feeling a faint, familiar presence. Though he'd rid himself of the cursed charcoals, he knew one thing for certain: the eyes of the abyss had seen him, and once seen, one could never truly escape their gaze. Story 7. Shadow of the Old Manor. Eric Caldwell was a seasoned real estate agent, one of the best in his agency. He'd closed deals on haunted houses, remote cabins, and eerie estates that no one dared touch. But he had yet to face a property like Blackwood Manor, a sprawling estate on the edge of town, cloaked in a sinister history and silent for nearly a century. The manor was his latest assignment. Despite its grandeur, no one had set foot inside for decades, and rumors had swirled about mysterious disappearances and ghostly sightings. But Eric was skeptical of supernatural tales. To him, the only spirits he believed in were the ones poured in a glass. And the commission on the sale was high enough to make him brave any ghost story. When he arrived at Blackwood Manor, he found himself staring at a dark, towering silhouette against the twilight sky. Its tall windows gleamed, and ivy crawled up the stone walls, twisting like veins. The manor loomed as though it were alive, and a chill crept down Eric's spine. Ignoring his discomfort, he stepped inside, determined to catalog the place and take photos for the listing. The interior was as grand as he'd hoped. Mahogany woodwork lined the walls, chandeliers hung from the ceilings, and elaborate carvings decorated every corner. But it was dark, too dark. Shadows seemed to pool in the corners, unmoving, as if they had a life of their own. He turned on his flashlight and walked through the entry hall, the floorboards groaning underfoot. As he passed, the shadows shifted slightly, almost as if watching him. The sensation of being observed prickled the back of his neck, but he pressed on. Chapter 1, The Echoes of the Past. Eric moved from room to room, taking notes and pictures. The manor was grand but neglected, with thick layers of dust on every surface. But what unsettled him most were the portraits lining the hallways, ancient oil paintings of stern-faced men and women with cold eyes. Their expressions seemed almost lifelike, and no matter where he stood, their eyes seemed to follow him. In one room, he paused to admire an ornate mirror framed in silver. As he raised his flashlight to take a closer look, he noticed a strange reflection in the glass. Behind him, in the corner, a shadow lurked, tall, shapeless, darker than the others. He spun around, but the corner was empty. Shaking his head, he laughed nervously. "Get it together, Eric. It's just shadows." But as he turned back to the mirror, he froze. There, behind his reflection, was the figure again, closer this time. A dark, looming presence that felt cold and ancient. Its form seemed to flicker, bending and stretching like smoke. Eric backed away, feeling his heart pound. He turned and left the room, convincing himself it was just his imagination. But the memory of the shadow stayed with him as he continued his tour of the manor, creeping into his thoughts, an itch he couldn't shake. Chapter 2: The Whispering Shadows. Eric made his way to the basement, hoping to finish his inspection and get out as quickly as possible. The air grew damp and stale as he descended the stone steps, and the walls seemed to close in around him. As he reached the bottom, he felt a chill wash over him, an unnatural cold that seemed to seep into his bones. The basement was dark, even with his flashlight. Shelves lined the walls, filled with old books, bottles, and strange artifacts. But what caught his attention was a large, cracked mirror leaning against the far wall. It looked identical to the one he'd seen upstairs, only older and somehow more sinister. As he approached, the light began to flicker, casting strange, shifting shadows across the room. Then he heard it, a faint whisper, almost like a sigh. He paused, straining to listen, and heard it again, clearer this time. "Help us." The voice was soft, pleading, but it echoed through the basement, filling him with dread. He took a step back, his hands trembling, but the whispering continued, growing louder. "Set us free." He spun around, searching for the source, but there was no one there, only shadows, deep and dark, stretching out from every corner. The whispering voices merged, filling his mind with a cacophony of pleas and threats. "Stay with us. Free us." Eric stumbled, clutching his head as the voices grew louder, pressing into his thoughts. He felt an intense pressure in his skull, as though something were trying to burrow its way into his mind. With a final burst of energy, he sprinted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind him. Chapter 3: Possession. Eric spent the next few days trying to shake off the experience. He couldn't get the whispers out of his head, nor could he forget the sensation of those shadows watching him. But he was determined to sell the property, telling himself it was just nerves. When he returned to the manor a few days later, he brought a team with him. The presence of others seemed to steady him, and he felt safer knowing he wasn't alone. As they began to take photos and measurements, however, Eric noticed something strange. The shadows in each photo seemed darker, more pronounced, and in each one, a faint outline of a figure appeared in the background, lurking just beyond the reach of light. At first, he thought it was a camera malfunction, but then he began to feel strange himself. His thoughts grew muddled, his head heavy, and the shadows seemed to thicken around him, whispering, coaxing him deeper into the manor. One of his colleagues called his name, snapping him out of the trance. Eric shook himself, laughing it off, but he knew something was terribly wrong. Over the following nights, his dreams became dark and twisted. He saw visions of the manor in flames, shadowy figures dancing in the inferno, their faces twisted with rage and agony. He would wake, drenched in sweat, the whispers still echoing in his ears. "Set us free." By now, Eric could feel the shadows creeping into his mind, clawing their way into his thoughts. He felt compelled to return to the manor, as though an invisible thread pulled him there, tightening around his soul. Chapter 4: The Final Confrontation. One night, unable to resist the pull any longer, Eric returned to the manor alone. He wandered through the rooms, no longer seeing the grand architecture or the opulent decor, only darkness and shadow, shapes shifting in the corners of his vision. The whispers grew louder, clearer, urging him deeper into the heart of the house. He found himself back in the basement, standing before the cracked mirror, his own reflection distorted, twisted, almost unrecognizable. The shadows writhed around him, reaching out like tendrils, wrapping around his limbs, pulling him toward the mirror. "Release us," the voices hissed, more insistent, desperate. Desperate to escape, he reached out, pressing his hands against the mirror's surface. To his horror, his fingers sank into it, as though the glass were water. He tried to pull away, but the shadows tightened, pulling him in, swallowing him whole. He felt himself falling, tumbling through darkness, the voices surrounding him, filling his mind with images of suffering and despair. He was drowning, his consciousness fading as the shadows claimed him, filling him with an ancient rage. Epilogue: The new occupant. A week later, the real estate agency sent another agent to check on Eric after he failed to report back. They found the manor exactly as it had been, silent, foreboding, untouched. But something was different. In the basement, they found a portrait that hadn't been there before. It was a large painting of Eric, staring out with cold, lifeless eyes, his expression twisted in a grimace. His once vibrant face was pale, his eyes dark and sunken, as though his soul had been drained. And in the reflection behind him, faint but unmistakable, was the outline of the shadowed figure that had claimed him. The new agent shuddered and left, but not before he felt the chill of eyes on his back, watching him from the shadows. To this day, Blackwood Manor remains vacant, its halls echoing with whispers, shadows lurking just beyond the reach of light. And those brave, or foolish, enough to enter swear they hear voices calling out, begging for release, and feel the cold, sinister presence of a man forever trapped in the shadow of the old manor. If you like this scary horror video, subscribe my YouTube channel for more new interesting scary video. Thank you.